In a small knit church community, there was a young woman named Miriam. She was known for her devotion, a commitment that ran so deep it seemed like a second nature. Miriam had grown up in that church, and as the years passed, her presence there became as much a part of the sanctuary as the well worn pews and the light streaming through the stained glass. Her faith was her strength, her guiding light, and the community often looked to her as a model of spiritual dedication. But there was one thing that Miriam's faith hadn't brought her yet: a husband. At 27, she was one of the few in the congregation still single, and though she rarely admitted it, loneliness gnawed at her in quiet moments. She prayed fervently about it, trusting that in time the Lord will provide her with a godly man, someone who shared her values and commitment. Then, one Sunday morning, the pastor delivered a sermon with a passion and conviction that captivated the room. Pastor Charles was a charismatic leader, a man with a booming voice and a reputation for delivering sermons that felt like personal messages from God Himself. Miriam, like so many in the congregation, looked up to him, trusting in his spiritual wisdom. That day, after the service, Pastor Charles asked to speak with her privately. Miriam's heart skipped a beat. He had never shown her particular attention before, and she assumed it was some kind of spiritual counsel. When she stepped into his office, Pastor Charles smiled warmly, gesturing for her to sit down. Miriam noticed a peculiar glint in his eye, something that was both reassuring and unsettling. Miriam, he began, his voice low and calm. The Lord has revealed something very special to me. It's a message that concerns you. Miriam leaned forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt as if the walls of the office had closed in, and in that moment, she was completely vulnerable and utterly trusting. "What is it, Pastor?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Pastor Charles took her hand gently, a gesture that felt oddly intimate coming from a spiritual leader. "The Lord has revealed to me that I am to be your husband, Miriam. He has shown me in a vision that our union is blessed, ordained by Him." Miriam felt a wave of emotion wash over her. Part of her was elated, but another part of her was weary. She had always thought she would recognize the man meant for her, but this revelation seemed to be coming out of nowhere. She hesitated, her thoughts swelling, but she respected Pastor Charles too much to question him. If he said that the Lord had spoken, who was she to doubt it? "But Pastor," she began, her voice trembling, "are you certain? I I didn't expect." He smiled, his grip on her hand tightening ever so tightly. "The Lord's ways are mysterious, Miriam. He has shown me that you are to be my wife. This is His will, and I know you are a faithful servant who would never turn away from God or what God has planned for her." Miriam nodded slowly, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over her. Perhaps it was meant to be. She had prayed so long for a husband, and here was an answer. She convinced herself that this was her destiny, that Pastor Charles was the man the Lord had chosen for her. She trusted him, and that trust would lead her into a nightmare she could never have imagined. Within weeks, they were married. The congregation was thrilled, seeing their beloved pastor join with a woman they admired. The wedding was a grand affair, with Pastor Charles beaming as he stood at the altar, a proud and imposing figure, while Miriam wore a gentle smile that concealed the confusion and doubt brewing in her heart. The first few days of marriage were quiet, almost surreal. Miriam waited, hoping that she would feel a connection, a sense of love and warmth. But Pastor Charles was distant, cold even, a side of him she had never seen before. The gentleness he had shown in public was replaced by an indifference that left her feeling more alone than she had ever felt before. He barely spoke to her outside of church matters, spending hours locked away in his study, leaving her to tend to the household chores he demanded she take on. But she put on a brave face, convincing herself that marriage was an adjustment and that it was her duty to be a supportive and obedient wife. She kept up appearances, smiling as she climbed the pulpit beside him every Sunday, speaking warmly to the congregation, even though inside she felt like a stranger in her own home. Then came the first sign of his cruelty. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Miriam tried to start a conversation, hoping to bridge the growing gap between them. She gently asked him about his work, his plans, anything to make him feel closer, but he only glared at her, his eyes hardening. "You are a distraction," he snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "Do you think I have time for idle chatter? Do you think my role as a shepherd allows me the luxury of your mindless prattling?" The words stung, and Miriam felt a lump rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She apologized, retreating into silence, her heart sinking as she realized that the man she had married was not the man she thought he was. But she said nothing, clinging to the hope that things would improve, that he would soften with time. But they didn't improve. In fact, they grew worse. Pastor Charles became more controlling, more demanding. He forbade her from spending time with friends or family, insisting that her role was to support him and his ministry. "Your place is here," he would say coldly, his gaze piercing. "You are a servant of the Lord, and your duty is to me." The congregation, however, saw none of this. To them, Miriam was a shining example of devotion, the perfect pastor's wife. She continued to smile, continued to climb the pulpit each week, her radiant facade concealing the torment she endured at home. They had no idea of the cold stares, the harsh words, the bruises hidden beneath her clothing from the times he corrected her for speaking out of turn. One night, as she lay awake, Miriam began to understand the extent of his deception. She realized that she had been bullied by her faith, her trust in a man who used his position of power to manipulate and control. He had known exactly how to sway her, using the Lord's name as a tool to bend her to his will. But now she was trapped, bound by vows she had taken in good faith, and there was no escape. But Pastor Charles wasn't satisfied with controlling just Miriam's life. His sermons became increasingly intense, his demands for the congregation's loyalty more fervent. He encouraged them to give more, to serve more, to trust him as the sole voice of divine truth. His followers devoted time and faithfulness, and they did as he asked, never questioning his authority, never suspecting the dark side of the man they called their shepherd. And Miriam was forced to watch powerlessly as he continued his deceit, his manipulation. She knew how that he was a fraud, a man who wore the mask of a holy servant but harbored darkness within. But what could she do? Who would believe her? A woman who was expected to submit, to obey, to uphold her husband's reputation without question. It wasn't until Pastor Charles began to pressure her into getting involved in his schemes that she felt a spark of resistance ignite within her. He would boast about his influence, his power, and then he would turn to her, expecting her to echo his words, to support his lies. "We are one, Miriam," he would say, his voice a low menacing whisper. "You belong to me, and you will do as I say." But something inside Miriam had changed. The weight of the lies, the abuse, the betrayal had chipped away at her blind loyalty, revealing a core of resilience, and she didn't know she had. She began to see through his facade, to recognize the monster he truly was, and for the first time, she dared to imagine a life free from his control. The final straw came one Sunday morning as she stood beside him on the pulpit, listening to him preach about love, respect, and the sanctity of marriage. She felt a surge of anger rise within her. How could he stand there preaching virtues he didn't possess, while treating her as nothing more than a pawn in his twisted games? Miriam had spent months hiding her misery behind a bright smile, enduring Pastor Charles' coldness, his insults, and the loveless silence that filled their home. He was her husband in name, but he refused to touch her, shying away from even the smallest signs of intimacy. Miriam had assumed it was due to his spiritual calling, a devotion she could never fully understand, but deep down, the rejection weighed on her, making her question her own worth. One evening, after yet another silent dinner, Miriam found herself in their cold, quiet living room, her thoughts churning with frustration and doubt. Pastor Charles had retreated to his study as he often did, leaving her to sit alone, staring into the darkness. She had had enough of the loneliness, the secrets, the life she had so naively trusted him to lead her into. But tonight, a flicker of defiance sparked within her. She wanted answers. With her heart pounding, she quietly approached the study. The door was slightly open, and she could see Pastor Charles hunched over his desk, scribbling furiously in a journal. She knocked softly, but he didn't turn. She pushed the door open further, feeling a strange pull to cross a boundary she had always respected. Charles, can we talk? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked up sharply, his face twisted in annoyance. Not now, Miriam. Can't you see I'm busy with the Lord's work? Miriam's patience snapped. The Lord's work? She said, a hint of bitterness slipping into her tone. Charles, you haven't even spoken to me outside of church matters in months. I'm your wife, but it feels like I'm a stranger in this house. Pastor Charles slammed his pen down, his eyes flashing with anger. You don't know your place, Miriam. You are here to support my ministry, not to make demands. If you can't accept that, perhaps you are not as faithful as you claim to be. His words stung, but they also emboldened her. She turned and left the study, her mind racing. She knew he would never give her the answers she needed, but she was determined to find them herself. She waited until he had fallen asleep, then returned to his study, quietly slipping inside. The room was dim, the only light coming from a street lamp outside. Miriam's eyes fell on a locked drawer in his desk, one she had seen him open once or twice, but had never dared to touch. She searched for a key, eventually finding it hidden beneath a stack of old sermons. Her hands trembled as she inserted it, feeling as though she was on edge of discovering something that would change everything. When she opened the drawer, her breath caught. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all of a woman who looked disturbingly like her. The woman's eyes, her smile, even her posture were uncannily similar to Miriam's own, but the photos were faded, one as though they were relics from a different time. She turned one over, her blood running cold as she read the words scrawled on the back, "My beloved Sarah, taken too soon." Miriam's mind reeled. Sarah, had he been married before? He had never mentioned it, not even once. Why has he hidden it from her? And why had he married someone who looked so much like his first wife? The questions piled up in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. She kept digging, pulling out more photos, old letters, and then, at the bottom of the drawer, an old newspaper clipping. The headline sent a chill down her spine. Local pastor's wife found dead in mysterious circumstances. The articles detailed the death of a woman named Sarah, Pastor Charles's first wife, who had died in a supposed accident just 3 years earlier. The circumstances had been suspicious, but no charges had ever been filed. Miriam felt her stomach turn. Her hands were trembling as she put the article down, her mind racing with horrifying possibilities. Pastor Charles had been married before to a woman who looked just like her, and now the woman was dead. under mysterious circumstances. The pieces began to fall into place, and a sickening realization dawned on her. She was more than just a wife, she was a replacement. The next few days were torture. Miriam was consumed by fear, unable to confront him, but equally unable to ignore the truth. She did some digging of her own, reaching out to old contacts and following up on leads she found online. What she discovered was even worse than she could have ever imagined. Pastor Charles had not only been married before, but he had a long history of deceit. She discovered that he was hiding another, even darker secret. Days after Miriam found the haunting photographs of Sarah, the woman who looked exactly like her, a new layer of unease settled over her. Every time she glanced at Pastor Charles, she couldn't help but feel she was seeing someone else she no longer recognized. The man she once trusted as a leader, the man who claimed to be her husband, was now a stranger. Worse yet, she was beginning to see him as something sinister, someone who hid dangerous secrets under his holy robes. Late one evening, after a particularly long day at church, Miriam came home to find Pastor Charles' car already parked in the driveway. She felt a pang of dread. It was unusual for him to be home this early, and she had left for work early to avoid him, hoping for a moment of peace. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, and opened the front door quietly, almost as if not wanting to disturb whatever might be lurking inside. She immediately noticed something odd. There was faint laughter coming from the hallway, high-pitched and unmistakably youthful. Miriam's brow furrowed, her pulse quickened, and she moved closer to the sound. She hesitated outside their bedroom door, which was slightly opened, and peeked inside. Hello, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Tales by Lily. If you did, please don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay tuned on our next story. Thank you.